Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more at smartnitrogen.com.
Thank you to our show sponsors, The Truth About Ag podcast, The Canola School, and The Beef Market Update. The Beef Market Update is one of Real Agriculture's longest-running features. Hear Ann Wasco every second Friday to talk about the beef markets in Canada and the U.S., featuring cattle on feed reports, export data, calf run volumes, slaughter numbers, and more. Tune in to Real Ag Radio or get it on demand at realagriculture.com. Hello and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, joining you from sunny Calgary today, Lyndsey Smith. It is incredibly dry in Calgary. I had forgotten about what less than 80% relative humidity feels like. But here I am in Calgary. So good Monday to you all. It also means that it is 6 p.m. local time, and so this feels a little strange. But tonight we are going to talk about choosing a hybrid or variety. We're going to focus on canola and soybeans. Get your questions in early. We've got lots to cover. Of course, your reminder, if you do collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Let us know you watched the show, and we'll get those for you as well. Hello to Ray, to Jason, and to Jim, who's back. Well, thank you, Jim, for joining us. Wonderful to see you back live. We really do enjoy having everybody here to ask their questions, comments, do their heckling, as you will. All right, let's bring in our guests for tonight's conversation. We've got Paul Hermans with Corteva out of Eastern Ontario and Allison Bishop with BASF out of Central Saskatchewan. Welcome here.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Okay, so Paul, I'll start with you. Basically, Western Quebec. Let's face it, Eastern Ontario, Western Quebec, same thing, really. How are things looking? Some soybeans coming off, certainly. How are things going this week? We did have some rain yesterday.
Had some rain yesterday, Lyndsey, so it kind of shut us down today. But hopefully, guys will get going again tomorrow, Tuesday, and yields are just fantastic. I think we got about 60% of our crop off to date in Eastern Ontario, and I've never seen yields so high. So setting the bar for next year for sure.
Okay, and so what is it? We don't farm this year's weather, but we'll have to make some decisions for next year based on what happened this year and years past. Yeah, all right. And Allison, tell us about what keeps you busy in a week with BASF.
Yeah, sure. So we're still trying to finish up some canola harvest out here in central Saskatchewan as well. So that has been dragging on a little bit later than usual as well.
Mm-hmm. And now Saskatchewan had, depending on where you were, kind of a challenging season. Started off really great, and then the tap sort of turned off. What were the crops like around where you are?
Definitely really good. We actually had some pretty good moisture once again. That $1 million rain in July would have been a game changer for a lot of people. We all seem to miss it, so we're going to pray again for that next year.
Mm-hmm. It is the timing. It is always the timing. And I really wish we could order it exactly on time. Okay, so that, of course, is the one variable that we cannot really account for, is when the rain falls or how much rain we have. But there are so many other things when it comes to variety or hybrid selection that we can account for, and that is what we're going to unpack tonight. I do want to, and we're not going to start there, but I do want to make sure that we talk about specifically, and I'm going to put this out there for anybody in the chat. I do want to talk about weed control and our herbicide tolerance traits and the evolution of that within our canola and our soybean systems, and how that may impact the choices that we make depending on our weed spectrum. So that is definitely one of those things that if you've got questions about, please ask them. We'll tackle them as best we can. But let's start with, so I did say, of course, you can't farm, last year's weather kind of idea. But Paul, I'll start with you. When we're sitting down to make the decisions on the seed we're going to order, I feel like it gets earlier every year. But how much does, this year's, let's say, plot trials, maybe some variety results, how much should that maybe influence what you choose to do next year?
Well, Lyndsey, I think overall I like looking at multiple years of data, and we're always trying to predict the future, what's going to happen. And the best thing is looking at 3 or 4 years of data combined together to get a sense on how stable a product is basically going forward. So that's where I work with Corteva Pioneer. We do a lot of plot work across Eastern Canada, and taking a look at that data. That's what I basically do every morning now. Get up in the morning, run the numbers, see where we're at, what looks good, doesn't look good, and kind of go from there. So I really encourage growers to look at a lot of plot data. Maybe if I could bring up producer J slide 5, and it kind of shows the importance of that data and having lots of data. Use these charts a lot, and it's kind of the odds of selecting the right variety. So if I got one environment and there's a 2 bushel yield differences between two products, I've got about a 51% chance of picking that right product for next year. When we start getting up into that 30 to 200 range, you really increase the percent chance that it's the variety that's making the difference. And I've got to the right-hand side. This is a plot I actually took off last week, and it was in that little red triangle. Shows you the satellite imagery, basically plant health. And you can see some different spots in there because we had a lot of moisture this year. So we cut out the center part of it, took the best area for evenness to try and give every variety the chance to win that plot. So looking at lots of data really helps me feel a lot more comfortable with recommendations going forward.
Mm-hmm. So now, Allison, when we think about yield, and we do start with yield because obviously it is a huge driver for choosing what we're going to plant on how many acres, but of course it's not the only one. So soybeans, we talk about maturities too, but how important is it when we're looking at canola and we think about something like combing through the data? How important is it when we're looking at that we're looking at that hybrids that are going to do well for our area, for our maturity zone?
Yeah, you nailed it. It's so hard, and there's so many options out there. And so I always try to break things down by different management practices, what people are doing, what they look for on their farm, whether they're swathing or straight cutting. Yeah, the season zone that they're in, like you said, the location is very important. Their soil type, the weather that they may get in those areas, those are all factors that are going to influence your decision when you're selecting a hybrid.
So does that mean when you sit down to sort of go through some of this, should you cover up the ones that aren't even an option? Like when you're looking at that list, like how important is it to only focus on the ones that really, to Paul's point, have that, that yield stability, I guess, is what you're looking for in your area?
Definitely. And so even in central Saskatchewan specifically, most of my guys can still utilize a first generation clubroot resistant hybrid. So that might be a good example. So yeah, I don't even show them the second generation clubroot hybrids until they need those. I try to focus on what is applicable to their growing zone, their region, and where they will succeed with the hybrids that we have available for that specific grower.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so Paul, thinking about the plots that you're running, is it like farmers can get information from a couple different places? Of course, they'll get it from, their seed dealers, but how important is it to be making those recommendations or making those selections, on regionally specific data, which we don't always have? So do we need it? Do we need it in our backyard?
I think so. And I kind of, if I could go to slide 1, looking at variety selection, and there's a big difference, between Eastern Ontario and Quebec and Southern Ontario in terms of what we see potentially from a disease standpoint. So in my neck of the woods, on the left-hand side, white mold's the key disease, right? Sometimes in Southern Ontario, we don't get that. So when I'm looking at data, depending on the season and the disease pressure, I'm going to look more to Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec for white mold compared to Southern Ontario. Conversely, they have a lot more soybean cyst nematode disease in Southern Ontario. We're starting to see that more here in the east, but that might be a bigger selector. So it's that offensive plus defensive traits. And we're seeing a lot more, disease, brown stem rot, sudden death, soybean cyst nematode, but then starting to see a lot more weed pressure too. I've been in the industry for a while. When we first came out with Roundup Ready soybeans and corn, I was there for that. And we thought Roundup was going to be the savior of the world. But unfortunately, we get into this resistance in weeds. So I think herbicide selection, if it's less E3, some people are going to extend different products out there. But it all comes down to what is your weed pressure, the spectrum, and then using those herbicide traits to basically help with those weeds going forward. So as an example, horsetail, it's a big issue my way. So the Enlist system helps with that. Water hemp, fleabane, different weeds. So that really depends. It's on a field by field, farmer by farmer, geographic location that you really got to take a look at.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and this realistically, whether it's for soybeans or for canola, just sometimes the names change as far as diseases or pests or those sorts of things. And there's a reason I put them together, because I feel like soybeans gets picked on a lot as far as like everything likes to kill it. Canola is the same. It has a lot of things that would like to steal yield. Allison, so you mentioned clubroot. When we're looking at the variety selection or the hybrid selection on canola, clubroot obviously is one of them, but sclerotinia, which is white mold, can be an issue. How do you work with your farmers to sort of figure out which challenge you want to put more weight on when you're trying to decide which hybrid you're eventually going to go with? Like, how do you sort of go through that list of the things that are trying to kill it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do feel like one of the things that we always recommend as well is encouraging multiple different InVigor hybrids for one farm as well. We do have multiple good fits. And so this also is going to help reduce your risk on things like just your harvest management practices, that heat blasting in July that you may get, the disease like the sclerotinia, like you mentioned. This year we really saw a lot of disease. And in certain areas, it seemed to come in early and affect those hybrids a little bit more. And in other areas, it seemed like it hit the later season hybrids or the mid-maturing hybrids a little bit harder. So it totally depends on where you are. But to spread out that risk management by having multiple different InVigor hybrids on your farm is always a really good option. It also allows you to try some new different things too. So it doesn't put all your eggs in one basket. If you're going to try one of the new early hybrids, for example, next year, it just allows you to maybe put a quarter in or a section in of that, give it a whirl, see if you like it, see if it's a good fit for your practices, and go from there. So that's something I always recommend as well.
Mm-hmm. Mark shares that my own farm yield trials get by far the most weight when making variety choices. Even 15 to 20 miles can make a big difference here in soil type and climate. 15 miles, I don't know what that is in kilometers, Mark. Anyway, no, so so to that point, and Allison, great point about, trying it on, let's say, a quarter or in Paul, actually, this is a question for you. What is the Ontario equivalent of like a quarter that you would try it on? Is it like 20 acres? Is it 40 acres? Like, if somebody was going to try a variety, do you say do a 5-acre plot, do a 10-acre plot? What's the Ontario equivalent?
I would say it's a 5-10 acres replicated, though. I like to see replicated
Right.
strips across the field and across different management zones, soil zones, and then kind of taking that to yield. Yeah, quarter acre or quarter section, that's huge compared to what we have out
Well,
here.
hate
I
to
think
break
our
it to
average field size is probably like 25-30 acres in Ontario.
Right.
So
Yeah. Someone related a story to me about a Saskatchewan grower taking some advice and saying, I'm going to try it on a few acres. That was 1,000. So, Paul, that's sometimes how this works. Is a
that's
few acres might be 1,000. It all depends on your risk tolerance and what you're trying to find out. Okay, so but to that point, Paul, you said so 5 or 10 acre plots, let's say, but replicated.
correct. Yeah.
And then, so Allison, in that same context, exactly that of trying it on a quarter or 80 acres, whatever we want to. Would you do you recommend that also trying to replicate, or is that sometimes too much to ask as far as, because Paul also has a tall order, but I feel like he would show up there with the weigh wagon and help. I don't know if that's always possible if you're not doing variety trials. So how would you navigate that with a farmer as far as trying to do an on-farm evaluation?
Yeah, for sure. And I also do the hybrid trials as well, and I have multiple across my area. InVigorResults.ca is already live with some really good local results. So that's always a good option. But as Paul mentioned, every farm is kind of a little bit different too. And what growers are going to do is going to be different. So you can see different things on different farm. The InVigorResults.ca does show that we do replicated data across the farm. We have our agronomic excellence team that has data on InVigorResults.ca too. Those are also replicated 4 times and then randomized as well. So we can find some really good data on there. But usually when a grower is going to spread out risk on its farm, we're saying don't seed the whole 1,000 acres of your farm, or if you're a larger farmer, you don't want to be seeding maybe 10,000 acres of canola just to one hybrid. That's where we try to say spread out your risk and do maybe half and half, or maybe do a quarter of one hybrid and try some different things, right? You're going to have your go-to consistent hybrid. Like we've seen in the past, people love a certain hybrid and it's kind of hard to get them to move on to the next one. But even just to try and get your foot in the door or spread out that risk management, it's always a great option.
Some great questions coming in the chat, but Paul, I want to go to you on that one. I think canola and soybeans both, like corn as well. I mean, we do get updated new varieties quite often, unlike perhaps some other crop types. And I think it is still sometimes tough when people have a tried and true favorite to get them to try something new. Paul, how do you help growers sort of make that leap to the next best thing?
Well, I guess a lot of it, you have to have I hate to say it, a bit of trust and faith in the research engine that most companies have, right? And if I take a look in my area in Eastern Ontario, from a soybean standpoint, we have research plots before we bring them to customers. Our next stage is what we call product knowledge plots. So we're basically testing those brand new products in strip tiles. So by the time I bring it to a customer, I've seen it at least 2 years locally, have a good sense for what that variety or hybrid is like, strengths, weaknesses, positioning. We're doing a lot more research looking at different soil types, topography, all that type of stuff to really understand it down to earth before we bring it to a customer, and that really helps us position those products going forward. So, and another thing, Lyndsey, too, I know we talked about growers trying in that 5-acre field. Well, I always encourage that's year one. Well, next year you try it on maybe 10 or 15% of your acres, and you kind of build up and you have that kind of bell curve. So by year 2, 3, you're maybe 40 or 50%, and guess what? Something new comes in, and that product starts dropping off.
Now, Gore's got a great question, and Dana, I'll get to yours as well. But Gord Specksnyder asks, how comparable are disease resistance or tolerance ratings among different seed companies? So this is a great question because I think everybody knows what yield is, and we know what bushels per acre or tons per acre or whatever. We can all speak that. But it is a really big challenge to get to know how each company sort of puts their hybrids and varieties up against each other. So Allison, maybe I'll start with you, although I mean Gore's in Ontario, but how do you walk through this with growers as to what they're considering and how they might compare and contrast between companies as far as disease goes?
Yeah, that's a really great question too. And it depends on the disease specifically as well. We know that when it comes to clubroot, we do have the races that we're testing against. We have those on labels. We have a lot of transparency with that of what we currently have resistance to and what we're testing against. So that's very open. With blackleg, we're working on moving towards maybe a different path in the future. Ultimately, right now, the industry doesn't take minor genes into consideration, and we do really have a really robust minor gene package along with our major genes. So once we can take those into consideration, that might be something that we consider doing as well. And then I know that some companies have verticillium ratings out there as well. This is something that we're still learning about. There's a lot of new information out there every single year. So we're putting a lot of work and research into that as well. And once we have a good path forward, that we're always going to be confident, and we want to have the most, I guess, yes, like I said, confidence in what we're putting out there. So that's maybe why we're a little bit slower sometimes, but when we get to that, it's going to be a really accurate, really good rating. So yeah.
And verticillium, I sort of compare to tar spot experience in Ontario, where the disease showed up relatively recently, and the companies are working hard to screen what's existing against this particular disease, right? And then trying to put together resistance ratings or trying to rank it or whatever, in that this is a new pest that we have to sort of gauge what we have out there, and then we can start sort of breeding towards some resistance, which is pretty cool. But Paul, in the soybean context, how do we navigate an SDS or a white mold or when we're trying to navigate some of those diseases, how do we compare them?
So Lyndsey, I think, unfortunately, there's no consistent ranking between companies. I'm going to call a spade a spade.
Yes.
What one company might call excellent, another company might call moderate. And it all comes down to, I think, it's the amount of research a company does and across locations and everything else. And then, from my standpoint, we put competitor products in our plots, in our research plots, and we have our own ranking system, and then come up with a comparison between companies and everything else, and use that with working with our customers. So, and I can understand from a grower standpoint, it's confusing out there, because if you take a look at all the different ratings, and then I start throwing in relative maturity, corn heat units, it's getting to know it. And I would say, the best advice I would have is look for local information, do stuff on your own farm, and that's going to give you the best, predictor of the future. And that's what we're trying to do, is basically how that product's acting today, but what's going to be like 1, 2, 3 years down the road.
And disease is one of those that, let's say the year that you happen to grow it isn't a huge pressure year for that particular disease. It's hard to actually evaluate how it did for that disease if it wasn't the huge pressure, right?
Last year we had one of our biggest white mold years, and we're switching our whole lineup to Enlist, and I was happy that we had it, because then I could see the strengths and weaknesses of products, and we threw the ones out that were weak, right? And this year, if we had it, it would be a total different story for what does well and doesn't do well. So you got to take that all into context when you're looking at your seed decision and stuff. Going forward.
Those plant pathology people are weirdos, because they always they're like, it's been such a great year for disease. I'm like, you shut your mouth. But it is true. How else are we supposed to know how it stacks up if we don't have the pressure?
But and it's funny though, or it's not funny, but it takes time. Like, we had our breeders out like 5 years ago and said, hey, we're starting to see soybean cyst nematode, SDS. And they said, really? We didn't know that. We can put that into the varieties, right? So it's that local aspect and what are the issues. And then once they know about it, but it takes 5 to 7 years to get that through the research funnel before we see it basically out in the field, offering that to growers going forward.
Allison, do you have a direct line to the plant breeders where you're like, please, I would like this? And then they just 5, 7 years, you got what you need? Is it that direct?
Ask and you shall receive. I do have a direct line to them, but I don't always get what I want.
Darn it. Okay, we'll keep working on that. Okay, we need to. Yes, Jeanette adds, weed people are the only normal people. Jeanette, I'm not sure about that one. I'll be honest. My favorite, though, I have to tell you, when we do this show with entomologists, they come up with some of the best terms that we get out of all the scientists. Entomologists have the best terms. I'll tell you that much. Okay. So we're going to just quickly, we're going to go to, actually, speaking of strange disease people, we've got Albert Tenuta with OMAFA. It used to be OMAFRA, talking about disease nursery. So we'll go to that clip, Producer Jay, and then our first read of the night, if you will.
When it comes to variety testing, we often think about yield as being one of the most important aspects or factors that we look at. And we all know about performance trials for yield and that, but we also run disease trials as well, looking at our disease screening. And this is a great example here, whether it's corn, soybeans, and wheat. We want to evaluate what the varieties or hybrids perform under different disease pressures. Here's a great example of our sudden death syndrome nursery that we have out in the Rodney, West Lorne area. We've got 4 lines here that you can see. You can see this nice, tall, beautiful green, no symptoms, no yellowing, no spotting on these 2. And then these 2 here are showing early SDS symptoms, pretty uniform. We've got 6 different reps of these 2 particular lines, and they're all showing the same thing. We're starting to see typical sudden death syndrome symptoms here, starting from the bottom, working their way up the plant here. And then as you go farther, you can start seeing them starting to show up up the plant as well, those symptoms. And so it's important to get a good understanding of what these varieties do. Some of these varieties, like this one, performed very well when it was tested in other areas such as Iowa, Missouri, etc. But here in Ontario, under Ontario disease pressure, you can see that it's different. The rating's not the same. So there's my plug for local ratings, screening as well, because populations are different depending on where you are in North America and that. And so you can see differences from a local perspective as well. So when you're planning for next year, not only go for yield, but also take a look at those disease ratings, try to gear it towards your field. If you got SDS, SCN, northern corn leaf blight and that, really take a look at those ratings and try to pick the best hybrid or variety for your fields. You're going to love it. It's going to help you maintain both yield and get the best bang for your buck in 2018.
Thank you to our show sponsors, the Canola School, the Beef Market Update, and the Truth About Ag podcast. The Truth About Ag podcast is produced by Evan Schout and Christian Hebert of Farmer Coach and Hebert Grain Ventures. It aims to bring you closer to the heartbeat of agriculture through candid conversations and honest discussions. Find episodes wherever you get your podcasts, including realagriculture.com and the Real Ag podcast feed. Albert did look a lot younger. That's because that was in 2017, everybody, which was a long time ago. Okay, so great point there on, of course, trying to get the data as close to your area as possible, and being able to line things up. We've got a great question here from, sorry, I don't know what this name is, so maybe tell me if, anyway, phonetically, but how many hybrids can be in one trial to compare? So this is, let's put a little context on this. When you're putting these things together. So Allison, maybe I'll go to you on this first. If I want to compare a few, is, one, yes, I can put it on a couple fields. Should I have at least 3 so that I'm making a good judgment call? Like, is there a magic number as far as ones to compare if I'm going to do it on farm?
I don't think that there's a magic number as long as you can keep the data set in an area that's not variable, which
Right.
is extremely difficult. So I feel like now on our large grower scale trials, we try to limit it to 7 hybrids because we're replicating those. And so if you have an 86-foot drill, those trials are still getting really big. That's why we also like our agronomic excellence trials. They have condensed size commercial equipment. So they can actually put a lot more plots in a smaller area that has less variability and things like that. So that's definitely something that you're going to take into consideration. We used to have a lot more strips in our trials when our equipment was all around 40 feet. But yeah, the way that the industry is advancing, it does make it a little bit more difficult to do that.
86-foot drill, Paul. That's what Paul has, right?
Yeah,
that's for your 20-acre fields. No, you wouldn't be able to get in the field with that.
Wouldn't be able to turn it around.
No, it's like, that's it. You're done. One pass. Okay, so, but similar question. If I'm going to do, let's say, 5-acre plots, I'm going to replicate it. Should I throw 2 in there, 3 in there?
So I guess the big thing is, Lyndsey, is too many it's not good either. There's too much variability across the field. We usually recommend, 4 to 6, up to maybe 8 maximum. When we pull our data and looking at data sets, we actually only look at 8 hybrids or varieties apart. So I'll compare 1 to 8, 2 to 9, but I won't compare 1 to 9 because it's just too much variability in the field. So, and there's been lots of stats run, the chances of winning a plot with 8 hybrids, you're got about a 10% chance of picking the right product. So keeping it simple, I'd rather recommend, have number 1 that you're growing your 2 and maybe 1 or 2 new ones and keep it to 3 or 4, or better yet is split planters across a bunch of different acres to get more data. Basically is better.
Okay. And to that point of keeping your data straight, that's important. Make sure if you put the effort in to put the trial in, take it actually to yield and make sure you actually keep track.
And use a weigh wagon or a scale.
Weigh wagon. Yes. not the lovely, the yield monitor in the combine is lovely to send Snapchats to your friends when you're going downhill or uphill, depending on which way it goes. And but that's not how we measure our plots. Okay, it's not with our yield monitor. Okay, now
if I could say something going back to the clip there too, like I think the biggest thing is we got to scout and understand what the diseases are, what the problems are, because if we don't do that, it's a lot harder to come and pick that variety selection here, in the next couple of months. So did I have white mold? Was it brown stem rot? Was it soybean cyst nematode? We're starting to get a lot of those traits combined together, but in some cases, one stronger than another variety-wise. So depending on the issue, I'm going to pick that. And unfortunately, harvest is done. The crime scene's cleaned up. I can't tell what the issue was now, but hopefully people have got good notes and can remember back to, July and August what the issues were.
So Allison, that's actually a really good point, and we can talk a bit more. I think it's your slide 2. We've got some really good data about like that clubroot consideration as well. Canola is interesting because of course we can clip stems. a little later in the season, but at some point, especially with clubroot, it's too late to get a good sense of what was there if we weren't scouting earlier. So when would be, to that point of Paul's of trying to get the best handle on what's happening in our field, when are sort of the key times that I would be scouting and making note of those, if, let's say, it's diseases that I'm trying to keep track of?
Yeah, you can start really early for lots of diseases, but most of them become very, very apparent at that 60% seed color change or even a little bit before that. Anything that's going to start causing that premature ripening is going to be a dead giveaway for some of these diseases. And lots of times it is confusing between one or the other. I really, really promote PCR testing from an accredited lab to get those results because it can become very confusing, especially when you have multiple different diseases in one field. Usually it just ends up you can point your finger at one, even though usually it's multiple. So yeah, I usually say if you can find like clubroot, if you're walking into an approach and you see just one little patch of dead plants, you're going to want to go there right away and start pulling those plants out. For something that is like blackleg, you're going to want to do a full W pattern and start walking through your field. Everybody laughs at me when I say that because nobody walks through standing canola at 60% seed color change. But
yeah.
try to do the best you can to get a good data set and start pulling those and doing clippings. And like I said, take a good look. And if you're confused or if there's multiple things going on, make sure you're just sending them to a lab that's going to do some PCR testing for you.
I dare anyone who has not walked a canola field at that time to try. This is where I think like drones could come in really handy, that you could just put in with, some sort of sampling mechanism and you just drop them in and do it that way. Anyway, we'll work on that. We'll figure that out. Okay. Producer Jay, if you could, Allison's second slide, I think, is on clubroot, right? And so you did talk about those minor genes that are in the mix. So these are the kinds of things that I love this show for, is that, so if I were looking at this, how as a grower do I read a chart like this? So walk me through this of how this would help me make my decision.
Yeah, so we actually do have a really good decision tree as well. So I see that link is on the bottom too. And it kind of goes through all the steps when you're making a decision on your clubroot genetics as well. It does show you all your first generation resistant clubroot hybrids too, and which pathotypes were present or that we tested against and got registration against at the time that we registered those hybrids. So we do break them out into first generation clubroot resistance and second gen. When it comes to second gen, you'll see that we now have resistance to 12 different pathotypes on there. And we're always trying to find improvements on our genetics and everything like that. So we are trying to source new pathotypes. We haven't seen a resistant breakdown for second gen yet, but that's always something that you have to keep in the back of your mind. I'm sure that's our breeders' not worst nightmare, but it's something that they have to take into consideration every single day. So it's always something that you have to be working on and find a path forward to. So this does show that the pathotypes that we are registered against, it's nice and clear for growers to see if they are getting these samples or testing done in their field. They can easily just put them side by side and see what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Okay. Mark wanted to know more about what's a PCR test. So, and thank you, Jeanette. I love it when we have such wonderful people in the comments that can handle some of these questions, but it is a DNA test. And so people might be more familiar maybe with testing a weed to find out what it's resistant to, right? We might use PCR testing for something like that. But in the case of clubroot, we're testing soil for spores, right, Allison? Like we're doing a test for what spores are actually, or if there are spores in a soil sample.
You're typically either doing a soil sample for diseases or you're doing a stem cutting sample. So
yeah, and sending it in. Yeah. And so because we can actually get down to pathotype, as you show here, if we wanted to, I'm not saying everyone's going to do that, but you could. So we do have some tools for actually testing some of this. Jason would like to point out that there isn't a short enough canola hybrid that I could walk through at 60% seed color change, and he is correct. That is true. Maybe in the very horrible drought years, maybe, but that's about it. Okay, so the other thing, Paul, I wanted to touch on, you mentioned, of course, the diseases, and before we switch to the weed conversation, because that's a good one too, but that some of these diseases, of course, happen together, or we also have perhaps genes that work with or against these diseases together. SCN and SDS, so soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome, the disease buddies, as we like to call them. So the East often does deal with white mold, perhaps more than, our Western Ontario friends. What about SDS and soybean cyst nematode? Are we seeing more of it in the East?
So definitely for sure in the East, and I would say in the last 3 to 5 years, we're picking up a lot more. I've been working with Agriculture Canada and taking soil samples and sending them to do SCN testing, and I would say about 40% of the samples that we have sent there have come back positive for SCN and some fairly high numbers. In my area, kind of have a central pocket in central area of Eastern Ontario that's high, and so it's something to be definitely concerned and to watch out. And it's ironic, 20 years ago we thought it would be here. It probably was here in low levels, but we're just starting to see the higher levels now as we're getting more into that corn bean type of rotation in some areas, and that's starting to show up. So
Mm-hmm.
not sure.
There we go.
Variety selection is to get out and do some soil tests. Beat the test, beat the pest, take the test, do a
Great.
soil sample, and that was a tongue twister there for a second. And do that, and then at least for your own operation, and then you can use that information to look at varieties, different resistant genes for soybean cyst, and kind of go from there.
Yep. Yes. Take the test to beat the pest. There you go.
Exactly.
I said it too.
I like your comment though too, Lyndsey, about doing for weed DNA testing too, right? That we have that capability, not only to identify the weed, but also if it's resistant to certain herbicides. So that really helps us with herbicide selection, trait selection, and everything else going forward as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jason's got a great question. Where are companies at with verticillium and blackleg tolerance or resistance in canola? We'll do the second part of the question in a minute. Let's start with verticillium. Allison, you touched on this as well. So we'll go over it again though, but where are we at? I know that verticillium is definitely new, and so it has been one of those ones that we're screening for. Where are we at?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're still learning lots about this disease. We don't really know what it equals to when it comes to yield losses, things like that, how it affects different hybrids, even though that there is a slight difference. Is it based on maturity? Is it based on the onset of disease? Things like that. Lots of people ask questions about swathing versus straight cutting. It seems like there's lots of inconclusive answers at this point. We are working towards a solution specifically with InVigor hybrids. So once we have a confident path forward, we would be, that's kind of where we're at right now. But we do make sure that we have lots of confidence before we provide labeling or anything like that. So hopefully we can get there and have a path forward.
Mm-hmm. It does. It's interesting. And Paul, sort of like with, knowing that, let's say, soybean cyst nematode was in the East, but it didn't maybe really take off until certain conditions were sort of met. We've seen something similar to that, say with Aphanomyces in Saskatchewan. And then even verticillium, like maybe it's been around longer than we thought. And then, it just reached a certain point, a tipping point really, where we start to notice it more. And so it definitely, I would say, is one of those questions when it comes to these diseases as to what is available or what's coming sort of down the pipe. So now Jason's next question, we are going to go into that conversation. This is an important one. So one of the things that we have as an advantage for some of these varieties and hybrids, we do have herbicide tolerant systems. For a while there, we really had, one main option, but of course that has evolved, and now we have a few different options, and we have stacked traits, which is kind of cool. So Allison, I'll start with you. Just sort of so everybody knows sort of what we're talking about. When I think we're probably familiar maybe in the corn side, but especially for Western Canada, when we're talking a stack trait, what would that mean in regards to herbicide tolerance in canola?
Yeah, so an example is the InVigor R354PC. And so there is the L and the R on front of that, which means it's a Liberty Link and a Roundup Ready technology associated with it. So you ultimately have the option to use either of those technologies when you are spraying for weeds. So I feel like the biggest reason that guys pick this hybrid specifically, or growers pick this hybrid, is for that ability to have an InVigor hybrid, but also to be able to spray Roundup on it. So that's what we're seeing when guys are struggling with certain weeds, like resistant wild oat, for example. That's where I feel like the majority of these acres end up going. So yeah, They can also have the opportunity to go in and spray Roundup Ready and then do their second pass with Liberty Link to get multiple modes of action in one season. So that might be another fit, but usually it's for growers trying to target a specific weed for sure.
Now, we're going to talk about volunteers after, because of course that's the next question that usually comes up. If we're going to add more tolerance or resistance within these plants, are we just creating a headache down the line? And it's a fair question. We will talk about that. But Paul, from the perspective of going to the enlist traits, Jason's question, is it positioning as weed control first, ahead of variety performance, or how does this work sort of as far as this goes hand in hand? How do we approach that?
So, Lyndsey, you always heard me say it depends. And that's agronomist's typical answer, right? But honestly, it's going to depend a lot on what's your key issue. Obviously, with the Enlist E3 system, soybeans, we're trying to bring the best genetics with the traits. But if I'm in Southern Ontario,